Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad that you are with us. Welcome to our webinar, which we're calling Living Wisely and Loving Well in the Current Crisis, a conversation about social justice in a time of pandemic. We are so glad you're with us. My name is Carolyn Arends. I'm Renovaré's Director of Education. I'm going to introduce our awesome panelists in just a sec, but first let me give you some instructions. You will find as participants that you are muted and we can't see you, unfortunately, but it means a lot to us to know that you're there. And what we want you to do is, as questions come up while we're having this conversation, go ahead and submit them using the little Q&A, click on the little Q&A logo at the bottom of your screen, submit your questions, and we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll try to spend the last 15 minutes or so going through some of the questions that you've submitted live. In the meantime, for the first 45 minutes, many of you submitted excellent questions in advance, and so we'll be using those to facilitate our conversation. Also, you should know that this is being recorded, and so if something comes up and you have to go, you'll be able to watch the rest of it later. Anyway, there are lots of you here. We know there's a deep hunger around this topic, and we know especially that you're excited about our panelists today. As you can see, I have with me Chris Hall, Renovaré's president. Hi, Chris.
Good to be with you. Good to be with you.
And then we have really two of our most eloquent and engaged Christian social activists kind of on the planet today. So we're very pleased to have them with us. We have Shane Claiborne. Hi, Shane.
Good to see you guys, and good to know everybody else is out there and in space somewhere.
They are, I promise. I didn't just set this up, you know, like when you invite someone to a big party and really you're the only one there. I did not do that. There's actually a bunch of people with us. And of course, there actually are. And then Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove is with us too. Thanks for being here, Jonathan.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, like I said, we have a ton of great questions here. And so I'm just going to start asking them of you. But just before I do, I think people would be interested to know how it is that the three of you, Chris, Shane, and Jonathan, came to know each other. So can you tell us how it is that you came to be pals?
Oh, I can tell you. I can tell you. These two are former students of mine, so that's how I got to know them. I think
we are still students of yours, Doc.
Well, that's the truth right there.
So I was thinking about both of them. I can remember I was teaching a class in theology. Jonathan, I think, would remember this. I think it was called Theological Thinking.
Yeah.
And I remember looking, and there in the back row was Jonathan and his future wife, Leah. So
we were thinking about theology and other things.
I think you were. I think you were. And then regarding Shane, I attempted for a stretch at Eastern to teach Shane Greek.
Alpha, beta, gamma.
Alpha, beta, gamma, delta.
I got it, man.
Yeah, and when I first met Shane, he had on a white collared shirt. I think it might have even been buttoned. Very short hair, and that's how our friendship started. And it's been since I think the mid '90s or 97, 90 something. When did you guys graduate?
I graduated in '97.
Oh wow, yeah. So it's been a stretch. When did you graduate, Jonathan?
03 for me. Shane's an old guy.
Yeah, he's a little older.
An old man. And and Doc, you also did our wedding. You performed for my wife Katie and I.
That's right.
Chris officiated our wedding ceremony, which was just magical, and our reception here on the block. We rode off on our tandem bike. It was lovely. So
yeah, that was really special. So we'd known each other for a long time. They've taught me much.
That's awesome. Well, we are sure glad for your friendship and glad to be able to benefit from it today. And I'm just going to dive right in. There were a lot of questions really relating to the topic of the webinar today, or our title today. And this one from Rick Shoup kind of help sum it up. It's a broad question, but I think it'll give you lots to talk about. He says, given the current social restrictions, how do we help the most vulnerable to remain safe, sheltered, protected, and cared for? How do we help in this season? You want to lead off, Shane?
Well, first of all, thanks for the question. I mean, I think even being sensitive to the folks that are vulnerable is a good starting point. And there's, relationship makes a huge difference. Proximity to folks that are, vulnerable in these situations that we might not think of. I am aware that there are a lot of folks that are victims of domestic violence, that being, hunkered down in a home is not a safe place. There's folks that are in prison that are really vulnerable. And now there's actually a lot of prisons don't have any visitors now. So that's a really lonely place for a lot of people, a really vulnerable place. And of course, the folks that don't have health coverage, people that are on the street. Our friends run a free medical clinic, and they said, what the heck does it mean to social distance and quarantine if you don't have a house? So they are creating a way to do public showers and distribution of resources that's both responsible and compassionate right now. And we've ramped up a lot of our food distribution here because there's 100 agencies that weren't able to stay open during the pandemic. So we're doing a lot more. And our prayer has been that we would be both cautious and courageous. That we would be compelled by love and not fear, but we would also be smart. So we're, trying to do that. We're giving away a lot of blankets and toiletries and food, all the time across the street from where I'm at right here. And neighbors are taking care of neighbors, but we're trying to do it well. And so that's, I think, we do need to be thinking of those who are vulnerable, and those of us that can take, some risks, we can do that in responsible ways as well. So, yeah.
I'm here in North Carolina, and early on, we realized that this was a disease that was going to impact older people in terms of age demographic most. And so we organized about 300 folks in the community here who are young and not at great risk in terms of the demographic factors, and said, would you be willing to partner with an elder in your community and stay in touch with them by phone and safely, but also be willing to take things to them when they need it, from the grocery store or from the food bank or whatever. And so we've been doing that. And one of the things that I've been learning, sort of talking to folks through that process, is that yes, it's a big help for the people who are at home, but it's also been a huge learning experience for the young people, many of them college, post-college professionals here in the Triangle area who felt like they wanted to do something and they could do this. They're learning a lot about all of these obstacles that Shane is naming, things they haven't personally experienced. What do you do to to practice safe social distancing when you live in a household of 3 generations and 4 or 5 people have to go do service jobs every day in order to have income, or what happens if you're an undocumented person and the relief bills that have been passed offer you no promise you're still going to work every day. So people are sort of having their eyes open to the situation that's been real for a lot of people for a long time. And I'm part of a group called the Poor People's Campaign. One of the things we've been saying is that a pandemic like this really reveals the deeper underlying conditions, not just in people's bodies, but in the body politic, right? There are real fissures in our society. And as we watch this disease spread through the country, it's spreading most quickly in those fissures, in those places where people have been left out. It's the uninsured, it's the undocumented. The rate of death among African Americans is almost double that of white folks in almost every state where we have data now. So it's clear that this is not impacting people equally. That's not because of the disease, it's because of how our society has been structured. And I think it has to educate us about, how loving our neighbor is not just doing something for somebody close to us, but also trying to change these structures that have left some people in the shadows.
Really helpful. There's you both have mentioned helping, but helping responsibly. And there was sometimes in the questions that people submitted, they felt a real tension. You know, we called this living wisely and loving well. And people felt like, to live wisely, I'm not sure I can love well. And some folks push back, like James Buckley said, for him, there remains a paradox that Jesus, he says, Jesus would probably not have observed social distancing. He imagines COVID-19 like it was viral leprosy. Well, you know, wonders if he should just be going to people anyways, despite the guidelines. Well, what do you guys think about that? Would that be loving people well? What do you think, Chris?
I have my doubts. I'm feeling my heart's sad. I heard yesterday in the news of an African-American pastor who has died in Virginia because these folks went ahead and had a church service. And he contracted the virus, and now his life has passed. This is really, I think, a time for discernment. What would the Lord have me do? I'm looking at these two guys, and they're younger and they're more lively than me. I'm in the high-risk group. I'm 70, and I have asthma. So I really am stuck at home. So what can I do here? Well, surely I can remain attentive. This morning, you know, I didn't know what else to do but wake up in the morning, here at home, and at the back of my journal, just have reminders of different situations that I can be praying about. So I have ambivalent, let me put it this way, and maybe these two guys will argue with me, won't be the first time. I have ambivalent feelings about, I don't want there to be unnecessary loss of life because of ignorance or because of poor choices. On the other hand, there's a need to reach people who cannot be reached, it would seem to me, by other than drawing near. And this question about, well, what would Jesus say, or how would Jesus act? I think how can I put it? Maybe a special case study. Son of God, God incarnate, power radiating from his body, a host of issues serving Jesus himself. I do think that he would want, without doubt, he would want his disciples to be near the suffering and the poor and the sick. And there is a history. Maybe this would cause me to qualify some of what I've been thinking. There is a history in the Christian community when these kinds of things happen, of Christians going to where the need is rather than being separate from it. But at the same time, I'm thinking back to the time, for example, of Cyprian, who was a great bishop of the church. Cyprian lived in the 3rd century. He lived during a time that historians call the plague years. The plague years. And the situation he was facing was both severe persecution by Decius, the Roman emperor, who was desiring to eradicate the Christian community, and then a terrible plague broke out in North Africa. So for a period of time, Cyprian felt that as a leader of the church, he needed to preserve his life so that he could be with others in the midst of these terrible occurrences, whether it be persecution or suffering. But then there came a time when he felt led by the Holy Spirit and the providence of God to show up. And when he showed up, it was not long before he was beheaded. He had a period of time from 248 to 258 when he was seeking to lead the church well. And generally speaking, the pattern in Christian history in response to plague or sickness and so on has not been one where the church has retreated to try to protect itself. It's rather where the church has gone to be with people, taken chances, and sometimes Christian folk have died as a result. So it's a time where deep sensitivity to the Spirit is called for, along with a good dose of courage and perseverance and so on.
And you know, when we ask what would Jesus do, for about 2,000 years, you know, what Jesus does is very manifold in this church that you're talking about. And it seems to me that, the body of Christ is spread all over the world, but there are basically two vocations in the midst of this pandemic. There are some people who are at great risk every day because they've been called to healthcare work, or they're doing the service work that keeps, life functioning for all of us. And I think it's really important to affirm that work, but to also acknowledge that, what the best public health advice is to people who are not in those roles is that you stay home, not just to protect yourself, but to protect everybody else, right? And I think that's where these pastors who've been defiant and been saying, that it's a matter of religious freedom to gather are in many ways failing to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. If we're going to slow the spread of this, it's not just about the risk to us, but it's about, how that can spread through people and can overwhelm healthcare systems. And then, there's just
a domino effect.
Yeah, I said earlier that we're trying to be cautious and courageous, and I think that's a delicate dance right now, is to know what does fearlessness look like and what does caution and care and wisdom look like right now. So love. I think the question is, how do we love our neighbors well right now? And there are people, I think, who can take more risks. And if the person asking that sounds like they might be one of those, there's certainly places like around the corner from here, St. Francis Inn, that are feeding 300 people a day that really can use volunteers, because a lot of the seniors that volunteer there are not able to do that right now. So I think there's a place for folks to, my mom right now, she's about Chris's age. I won't throw her under the bus, but she's making masks every day, for other people. So I think there's a lot of ways to step up, and show love. That's a very pretty
This is from
one.
Debbie, my wife.
That's
She's been
very
making
nice.
these for folks.
Nice pattern.
That's
pattern.
nice.
I thought it was a very attractive pattern, actually.
I do think it's worth that's real nice. I think it's worth saying that sometimes we have this knee-jerk reaction that this is my right. This is my religious freedom to worship right now. No government can tell me when and when not to worship. And there's a part of that I resonate with. I've gone to jail for things. So is Jonathan. We're still trying to get Doc in handcuffs. But but there's convictions that we have that are beautiful. And I wrote a reflection about this in response to those pastors that were saying we're going to worship anyway. And there's not just one, but there's several now that have died after directly related to having public services, and even saying things that this is a hoax, and things like that. So I think, the question is, what does love require of us right now? And what would Jesus do in our place? Because there's a whole lot of dynamics that are different now than they were 2,000 years ago. And there is a place for risk. There's plenty of stories of saints and wonderful folks in church history that have been on the front lines, that have contracted the illnesses of folks that they were treating. In the same lines, we've got some tools that we would be, ignorant not to embrace and work with in our modern culture too. So, yeah.
I've heard about something of an economic risk that some people are willing to take that I'm encouraged by. In light of the most recent relief bill that was passed in the U.S. and Congress, provides a $1,200 stipend to everyone who's filed taxes in the United States, in recent years, and or to adults who are, in that category. And a lot of people have pointed out that there are 11 million undocumented people in this country who pay taxes all the time, but they don't have a Social Security number, so they're not eligible for these checks. And so there are co-ops that are forming in cities around the country to ask people to tithe a portion of their stipend to undocumented people in their communities. I think that's
Jonathan, how do we find out about those co-ops? Just go online?
They're being locally organized. So I don't know of a national network that brings them all together, but you can reach out to immigrants' rights advocacy groups in your community and ask if they could help facilitate. I think, given the way finances work, person-to-person exchanges are going to be the best way to do it. So that's how most of them are being set up.
Yeah, we've been doing some of that too in Philadelphia. So I think that's a really great idea. The thought is, like, how can we make sure the people that need that stimulus get it? And those of us that may be able to share that, you can share a portion of it or the whole thing with someone else that needs it, or an organization that's working with folks that need it. So that's a great idea.
Really helpful. I think this brings up, if I'm in a city somewhere in America, I'm in Canada, anywhere in the world, and I haven't really had much connection with folks working in this sphere, but the Spirit is doing something in my heart in this season. I long to help. I don't know where to begin. I don't know where initiatives are. What's the first thing I should Google? Who's the first person I should talk to? Like, how do I start to put feed on this desire to love my neighbor well when I can't just go outside and give someone a hug? What should I do?
Well, I'm a big supporter of organizations and networks that are led by the people most impacted, right?
Mm.
So if you become aware of any issue that's impacting people, Shane mentioned folks who are in prison. We've mentioned undocumented people. We've talked about people who lack access to health insurance, or folks that are poor, doing service work. This is all over the world. The Pope wrote a great letter to many of our movements around the world on Easter Sunday that said, now more than ever, this conversation about the essential workers has highlighted the fact that most of the people who do essential work are the people who don't get paid enough to live on what they're paid. And he actually said it's time for nations to think about a universal basic income. Well, that's going to take a while in many countries, but nevertheless, he addressed that letter to people's movements around the world, and you can find people's movements that are led by folks who are directly impacted, usually by just figuring out who those people are in your community and asking how they've organized themselves. We've built an umbrella organization in the United States called the Poor People's Campaign that brings together many of those groups, but there are people's movements all around the world. I would think in Canada, a lot of the movements that are led by Indigenous people for land rights would be important, and I would be interested to hear, I don't know, but I'd be interested to hear how the coronavirus is impacting Indigenous communities there.
Yeah, and my answer is I don't know, but that makes me want to find out. Yeah.
I'm real convinced that a lot of times what our core issue is not a problem of compassion, but a problem of proximity and of relationship. And Mother Teresa even had a great line on this. She said that it can be very fashionable to talk about the poor, but not as fashionable to talk to them. And I think a lot of times we have a relational disconnect, and it's hard to love people that you don't know and you don't know where to start. Another friend of mine says the hardest part about running a marathon is not getting to the finish line, but getting to the starting line. So I can appreciate this question. I think part of where we got to start is by going where there are already people that have a bridge in those communities or are from those communities. I even put a thing up on Easter. One of the most creative things that I saw was a friend of mine's church in Nashville, Tennessee, through the wonders of technology, had one of our brothers who's living on death row. Chris, you met him. Kevin Burns, KB. I got to be there for his ordination. He's got a smile that just lights up the world. And he gave the Easter sermon from death row. And it's on there, and you can write him a letter. I put his address up there. And he's the pastor of Unit 2 of Death Row in Tennessee. So he knows, the other guys there. And a lot of them, especially when you can't get visitors right now, could really use, some friendly letters and things like that, just showing, and he'll write back, But I think we've got to figure out some of those connections. Our city has a whole movement around immigration and the new sanctuary movement. And each city has different movements, like Jonathan was saying. But for some of us, I think we just it's a matter of getting in there and just building a relationship with a few folks, and then the door opens up from there. But recognizing that's helpful, that it's not a matter of compassion sometimes, but more just of proximity and relationship.
Would you who are listening in, would you write Kevin's name down right now? Write his name down, Kevin Burns. Kevin Burns, he's at Riverbend Maximum Security Prison outside of Nashville. And a wonderful man. When he was real young, made a bad mistake, but his life radiates Jesus. Would you write his name down and pray for him? Maybe drop him a line. Maybe drop him a line I didn't know, Shane, I didn't know that he preached on Easter.
Oh, you can hear the whole sermon. Yeah, it's just pure gospel, man. It's a
Oh,
beautiful Easter
he's
sermon
a
from Death
wonderful
Row.
guy.
Yeah, and yeah, so that's a good place to start.
You know what changed? Let me suggest a spiritual discipline that Jonathan and Shane have practiced. They helped me with. Um, it's not one that we can practice so much now in the midst of this pandemic, but Shane was talking about the importance of relationship, the importance of meeting people and being in relationship with people. And when these two got involved in this kind of work, and when Shane, for example, moved down to Potter Street in North Philly, what year was that?
98.
Yeah, 98. I felt, and I'm a professor at Eastern University, teaching about some of this stuff, and having wonderful guys like this to work with. But I felt a distinct nudge from the Holy Spirit to actually, Chris, you're teaching about this stuff, move your body, the discipline of moving my body to a place consistently where I can be in relationship with people that I might not normally be in relationship with, because I live out in the suburbs. Outside of Philly, I live about 35 minutes from downtown Philly. So what I started to do is just to learn is to move my body down to Potter Street. I think it must have been around 1998 or so. And have tried to, over the years, not as often as I would like, but over the years, just to get down there, be with a Simple Way, be with Shane, occasionally with Jonathan in certain contexts, and seeing folks and hearing folks that if I had simply stayed out where I'm sitting right now, I would never have formed the relationships. I don't think that my heart would be soft like I'm praying that it is now to these issues and these folks. The discipline of moving your body.
So what we've been exploring is I love that discipline, but how do we move our bodies? how do we achieve that
in a pandemic, it's
proximity
hard.
in a pandemic? And that's what we've been talking about. Are there ways to achieve that kind of proximity without risking being a vector of the illness to vulnerable groups? And what I'm hearing is research, get on the phone with people, write letters. Is there anything else that you would coach us with that?
Again, different in different places, but almost anywhere in the United States right now, Meals on Wheels and food banks need volunteers, because those services are almost entirely supported by retired people. So their normal volunteer base is the group of people who are most vulnerable. And so there's an opportunity for, anyone who feels like they can put on a mask and, practice all the social distancing and hand washing and be relatively safe. I think they can definitely engage their community in that way. And you meet, by doing that, the most food insecure people in your community.
Right.
Yeah, and some of the protocols have had to change on this, right? So that like what you used to be able to bring a youth group or church group in with 12 people and, sort through food, we can't do that right now. So like what we have is 4 volunteers every hour that we're working in rotations on. So, the need for more volunteers that can be available is really there. And so that's a great one. And, I think this is a really strange, season to live through. And so things are not normal. And there's other things I think we can learn from it that we'll talk about in a minute. I think what we can learn from the solitude and the stillness. But there's a lot of opportunities in the middle of this too, to really mobilize and to begin to think through how can we take advantage of this unique space to engage some of our political leaders, some of the local folks that are thinking on around some of the policies, because like Jonathan said, it's revealing a lot of things to us. I mean, who we choose to let fall and who we bail out, in a pandemic reveals a lot about who we are as a country. And I think we've seen a lot of the effects of how much we need some policy changes. So there's a lot happening right now in Tennessee and other states around the death penalty. I mean, one of my hopes is that with so much happening in this pandemic that might sensitize us to the value of life, maybe we come out of this with a renewed passion and empathy for life and for people that are most vulnerable, and things like the death penalty. Maybe we can rethink some of those. You know, gun violence. Even in the middle of this pandemic, we're still losing almost 100 lives a day to guns. We had 5 murders just within a mile of here over the weekend. So the pandemic is taking lives, but there's other things that are really have been a pandemic for a while, you know, plaguing a lot of people's lives that are vulnerable. So we can take action on that in this kind of space that we often don't have to write letters, engage, you know, and maybe make some policy changes.
Really good.
Maybe to
oh, go ahead.
If I could bridge to the side of Solitude and the work we can do here. One of the things I've been reflecting on is, you know, for those of us who do have to be at home, and I saw a study the other day that said in the United States, 28% of Americans live alone at home. So, you know, there's a quarter or so of people who, when they're at home, they're alone. They're, you know, they have technology like this or telephone to talk to people, but they're, you know, in some version of isolation. I think it is a good time to ask what we can learn from those Christian witnesses who chose isolation in order to be formed. And I've been thinking about St. Anthony, who Doc Hall first introduced me to, who said, you know, go into your cell and your cell will teach you everything. And the point he was trying to make, I think, from the experience of the monastic life in the desert, was that isolation can be its own kind of curriculum and its own way of leading us to a place of self-knowledge where we also come to know God better. And I think this can be a really important place for accessing that compassion that Shane was talking about. There's actually some dialogue that happened between the desert mothers and fathers and folks who would come to talk to them about, you know, how to proceed in the spiritual life. And one of the things that they identified was that when you commit to do the soul work that happens in solitude, there's actually a demon that comes and tells you there are people out there in the world who need your help. You need to get up and go do something for them. And they taught them, no, you can't listen to that voice. You have to stay put and you have to do the hard work that you're trying to avoid by appearing compassionate. And I think, I think, you know, there is that work to be done. And for many of us, I think this might be a moment to do it and to let that become a curriculum. You know, a lot of the universities have gone online and now they're, you know, trying to sort of come into our households through Zoom and other things. But I think what the monastic tradition recognizes is there's a curriculum in solitude. You know, Saint Benedict dropped out of the university in Rome and ran away to the hills in Subiaco when he went into his cave. And he spent 3 years there. I mean, it was a sort of undergraduate education for him to read the Psalms and to be in solitude. And I got to go to his hometown one time, and I asked folks at the monastery there. I said, do you have any kind of historical indication for like how would he have known anything about monasticism? Like, why did this guy, you know, as a late teen, decide to go live in the hills by himself? And they said, oh yes. They said there were some Syrian monks who had been run out because they were called heretics, and they took refuge in the hills outside of Norcia. So this is a tradition that was passed on, and you know, all of Western monasticism, and you know, it's very practical gifts to us. One of which is hospitals that serve everyone. You know, we have these things because of the Benedictine tradition, and we have the Benedictine tradition because Benedict was willing to sit in his cave for 3 years and do that hard work of wrestling with, you know, what is my will? What is God's will? Am I willing to yield myself entirely to God's will? That's work we can be doing in this time.
Yeah, what I've been thinking about, Carolyn, a huge amen from me to what Jonathan just said, which should have been no surprise. What I've been asking myself, and maybe listeners, you can ask yourself this question too, particularly in light of what Jonathan just said. What is the Lord offering me during this time? what is the Lord offering me during this time when in significant ways my world has gotten much smaller, much quieter. So the Lord's offering us, in a manner of speaking, he's offering space, he's offering silence, he's offering pace, he's offering prayer, he's offering the opportunity, perhaps, to learn things that will be fuel in our tank or the formation of our character in such a way that when the time ends, we're changed people. We've been, our awareness of who we're, like Jonathan was saying, go to your cell and it will teach you everything you need to know. There's something that can happen in silence and solitude. Our character can be formed and shaped, honed, aspects of our character revealed to us that we never would have learned apart from that time. And so it comes to mind, even in Jesus's own life. In Jesus's own life, you have this pattern of intense ministry, withdrawal into silence and solitude and prayer, intense ministry, withdrawal, intense ministry. Comes to mind, Jonathan, it's so interesting you said that. I wrote 3 names down before we came on. They just came to mind. Folks who were in prison for extended stretches, and they learned things in that particular learning space, just as in the desert dwellers were in a particular learning space. So you had Nelson Mandela in a learning space on Robben Island for a long, long time. But in that learning space, his character, his perspectives were formed and shaped that when the doors opened, he was ready for what God was going to offer him. I across the way here on my bookshelf, a book that I read when I was at UCLA a long time ago, but really affected me. We were given a group of books to read before we started our freshman year. Weird back in those days. And one of them was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And what struck me about that book is what happened to him behind the walls of a prison, how he read and he learned and he studied, a learning space that enabled him to move out into that world of great challenge during his time. And then I thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who spent so much time at the end of his life in prison. But even before that, the times of solitude he had with his little seminary community and so on. I think action is safest when it comes out of being. Becoming a certain kind of people with a soft heart, an active mind, a responsive heart to the Holy Spirit. And then the Lord will have something for us. There were some people in the desert, what the Lord had for them for their entire lives was that silence and solitude. But people saw something in them. And like Jonathan said, started to come out. They wanted to talk to them. They saw a difference there. I think they saw Jesus.
This desert wisdom, something that's, we've all learned a lot from. And I've got in my downstairs, I wish I could show you, but it'll be difficult. But I've got this stained glass window of Saint Simeon, I think it is, who lived on one of the pillars. He was one of the stylites, like real. I mean, that's some serious solitude. They'd shimmy up his water and food and whatnot. But he lived like real isolation. So, and the funny thing is, the reason I have it is that the woman that made this beautiful frame and everything in this stained glass, she thought it was Jesus, and then she found out it was this wild monastic guy, and she's like, I don't want it anymore, so I got the beautiful stained glass in my living room. But I you think of the Israelites, 40 years in the wilderness, and Jesus 40 days in the desert, and that tradition of being shaped and formed in those times certainly can be something that happens for us during the quarantine. I mean, it's a little forced on us, but I think that we got this season of Lent that many of us give up things in leading up to Easter, like fasting or giving up chocolate or whatever, and they sensitize you, right, to some of our own longings. And also we have a new sensitivity to the gifts and how good chocolate is if you give it up for a while. And I think some of this isolation, hopefully it creates a deeper longing for community. And we come out of this space with a renewed awareness of what's important and what's not. I mean, earlier today, Katie and I just cleared out a bunch of crud from our house. Like we were able to, our friends run a thrift store that they're still taking donations. So we're able to get stuff out, but we've been going through, you know, and I don't know, somebody once said, walk through your house and figure out if something doesn't give you joy, get rid of it. So we've been trying to do stuff like that, you know, but I think of Sister Margaret, a friend of Jonathan and I's. I think you've met her too, Doc. She lived in the desert for a while, like literally in the Carmelite tradition of the desert. And that was very formative for her. But then she began to consider her vocation and calling. And she said, I found that the inner city is the contemporary desert. A lot of people are avoiding that place, but it's actually where we can find God in a really beautiful way, and where we can build a new society in the shell of the old one. And sometimes we got this idea that these desert monastics were fleeing society, but they were actually going to the desert to build a new society and to live out this vision of community. So now Sister Margaret is a part of a community with folks in recovery, because she started doing hospitality, and they've got I don't know, like 80 or 100 folks that are in advanced recovery, mostly from heroin, many of them incarcerated, that are living out their life. And it's another thing you think of, man, you know, for folks that are in recovery, face-to-face meetings are a part of how they thrive. So they're, you know, trying to be creative in the middle of all that. But I think that desert wisdom, like Jonathan and Doc have said, has a lot to bring us. We've found, like, having our prayer life and our physical life, doing meaningful work, is really important in those times. That's a part of the monastic tradition too. And so we've been blacksmithing. I've got an arsenal of guns in my basement that are decommissioned, and Katie and I are both blacksmithing and repurposing the metal. So I think having some craft along with our prayer life is helpful. So learn something new, you know, we're learn a new skill that might, you know, give life to you and other people during this time too. So there's a lot of things I think we can do with that space. We're going to have some of the best gardens we've ever had, Jonathan, because you got all the time in the world to be out in the garden weeding these days. So
I saw someone in the questions here saying, what if life has become more hectic in this time? And I think that's absolutely true, and certainly for people who are on the front lines of healthcare, but also for many people who are at home with, you know, kids who are usually in school, and they have work that they're now doing from home, and you know, they're preparing all their meals at home, and there's a lot, maybe more, happening in your house than normal. And the part of the desert tradition that I think can help us there, I mean, I find myself in that position in many ways. I live in a very busy household, and nobody goes out much these days, so there's a lot going on here all the time. But we've really been leaning into that rhythm that comes out of the monastic tradition. You know, what Shane was saying, that, you know, you find some way to work and pray, but the monastics ultimately said, if you're going to do that, you have to schedule it. And so fixed hour prayer became a way of saying, you know, this is when we pray, this is when we stop to pray, this is when we stop to pray. And I think however you can structure that in your hectic life at home or in the workplace, scheduling out places to pause, to say, here's where I'm going to embrace the quiet. You know, here's where I'm going to read a psalm. Here's where I'll sing a song that connects me to those saints who've been singing all through history, and to those who still sing around the throne of God. That's, I think that's important scheduling to do. And schedules can do a lot to help us just maintain mental health in times when our normal rhythm of life has been so interrupted.
Kind of like scaffolding.
Yeah.
Scaffolding for the day. Here's the scaffolding for the day that's going to help me to live well this day. I've been thinking a lot about single mothers. You know, someone who is so dependent on her work, and now she's at home with kids and wondering about the check and so on. I want to encourage people. I want to encourage people to fervent prayer. Fervent prayer for these host of issues that we barely touched the surface of. Fervent prayer for the Kevin Burnses who are sitting on death rows across the country. Fervent
Chris, could
prayer.
you repeat again where Kevin Burns is? One of our live questions is, what
sure.
prison do I write to? Yeah.
Sure. Kevin's at the River Bend Maximum Security Facility. Is the address, Shane, would it be Nashville?
I've got the address, the exact mailing address, because you have to have his corrections number on it. So it's on my Facebook page and it's on my Twitter page, and I can we'll maybe post it in the follow up to this to folks that were on it. But yeah,
that's great.
And I'm glad we mentioned Kevin, because when Shane and I were at the prison visiting Kevin, we walked in and Kevin greeted us, and then he came over and sat next to me and he said, first words, what can I pray for you about?
Mm.
And I said, well, my wife's health has not been great. And he said, what's her name? And he had a spiral notebook, and he opened up the spiral notebook and he had names, rows of names. And he said, I pray for these people every day. It's almost all I do here. So that's what I mean by fervent prayer. I'm not at all interested in spiritualizing anything in a way that would be not helpful to people. You know, I believe that we need to take our bodies certain places at certain times and so on. But I really do believe that, I really do believe this to be true. One of the most important things we can do would be to fervently pray. You know, I'm talking about early in the morning, scaffolding for our day, to fervently pray and pray, Lord, nudge me. Lord, nudge me. What are you offering me during this time? Is there a book that I've been meaning to read that I haven't read that could help expand my awareness? Maybe of the church's history in regarding to these issues, maybe of current events. And I've said to myself, I just don't have time for that. What are the, I just don't have time for that issues or things or people that now we do. And who might be the 5 or 10 people or 5 or 10 issues that we say, Lord, I'm going to lift this before you fervently for a good long stretch, and then see what happens.
So helpful. A few people in their questions talked about a tone of anxiety in their lives at this time, either anxiety or loneliness. Do you have any particular practices or coaching if that's kind of the main thing that they're contending with when they get up each morning?
I think the prayer that Chris is talking about is extremely important, but I think we always pray in bodies, and I listen a lot to the doctors on this. Physical exercise is really important for anxiety, and so is vitamin D, which comes from the sun. So if you can, if you can safely get outside and jog or walk, I think you can go a long ways. Make that part of your schedule too. I was in a soccer game just before we joined this, and it always makes me feel better to get out there and run in the yard with the kids.
Which you won.
Sometimes with fear, take steps like Jonathan is mentioning, and a high level of specificity is sometimes helpful. Mm-hmm. Take a piece of paper out and write out, Lord, I am afraid of this. I'm afraid of this. Get it out so it's not a fog in our minds or our hearts. Get it out in front of us. Lord, these are the things I'm afraid of. And then the next step would be something like this. Surrounded all with the grace of God. The next step would be, Lord, why am I afraid of this? What am I afraid of? Why am I afraid of this? And Lord, what are the possible steps I can begin to take to puncture that fear? Puncture the strength of that fear. And that's what exercise, I didn't know about vitamin D, exercise and so on, along with concrete spiritual disciplines someone might practice at that point.
Yeah, just a couple other thoughts. One of my friends I was talking to the other day was gave me the 3 Ps of the pandemic, which I thought were a little prescriptive, but I heard him out on it. And one of them, so they're these: positivity, productivity, and physicality. And some of these we talked about. So staying positive and like doing some positive things, like getting some of your input from that can, you know, stir our dreams and imagination. The second, physicality, doing things physically with our body as much as we're able to, and getting outside, and doing concrete things with our hands. And then that was the third one, was productivity, doing something that gives us meaning and purpose, which can be sewing masks, because it can be writing folks that are incarcerated. And I found those three real helpful. The other one is, I think we got to keep our joy alive, because it's easy to kind of just get in the funk. And so it helps me to be married to a very joyful person. But the other day, Katie delivered a chocolate Easter bunny by unicycle to one of our quarantine friends. And that was really lovely. But we're trying to post like circus videos and things like that. But I think like play has also got to be a part of you know, the vitality of some of our life. So doing something that, like, you know, is fun. Our friends just did like a virtual Easter egg hunt where there were like pictures that had Easter eggs embedded in them. And, you know, I think we got some like cool tools with technology. We can get creative with some of that. So
yeah, I think fun's an important spiritual discipline.
It's important to remember, hey, that we're in Eastertide now. It's
Mm-hmm.
supposed to, you know, we had, I heard a lot of people saying that this quarantine Lent was the lentiest Lent they ever lented, right? But now we're in Eastertide. So how can we be people of joy at the same time? Very helpful. We're getting close to running out of time. Let me just ask, we had a few questions for people that are leading churches or involved with churches about how the church can be church in this season. And we've just been talking about joy, but Roberta asked, are there good resources also to assist leading people in corporate grieving and helping the church together to grieve and to pray into this? Are you guys aware of things that might be helpful there?
Well, I know from our experience here that we've already had to have a couple of funerals where only graveside services were allowed because of the restrictions. The funeral homes are managing much of that, and informing people of this. So often, on top of grief, people are learning that they can't have their normal practices of grief together. I think that among other ongoing things that happen in church life is a reminder of how I think this season is teaching us that to be church together, we have to be connected beyond just the gathering in a building, right? We don't cease to be church when we can't gather, but we do have to figure out how we stay in touch with people. So I know our church has created small groups of people that are intentionally checking in with one another, and I've heard from other folks that that's happening. I certainly think doing that for the sake of grieving together with other people can be equally important. Sitting together and telling the stories is a lot of what happens in that time, before and after the service that happens at a church. And while it would certainly be better to be together in the flesh, we can listen to people and hear the stories of lives that have been lost over technology like this, over the telephone, maybe even out on a porch sitting at a safe distance.
I think, is your Book of Common Prayer called Ordinary Radicals?
A
I think,
liturgy for ordinary radicals.
yeah, I think that could be a wonderful resource in this time.
We've
That
heard
gives.
from lots of people all over the world who are doing it and using Zoom to do it together, who are doing it on Facebook live streams, and yeah, it's one of those resources of the fixed hour prayer, and it grew out of our communities that were very intentionally trying to hold together this practice of a contemplative life with an active engagement with the issues of injustice in our world. And so it tries to hold those two together, right? To root us deeply in the story of what God is doing and has been doing for a long time in the world, but also to remember the saints that are sometimes not part of that classic tradition, people who've been great disturbers of the peace for the common good, the Fannie Lou Hamers and Martin Kings and Dorothy Days and Daniel Berrigan. I thought of Father Dan earlier when we were talking, because while he was, an activist most of his life, and most famous in the United States for being one of the first priests to burn draft cards during the protests against Vietnam. The first time I met him was right when the war started in Iraq in 2003, and a little group of us gathered there in Philly. And I remember he sat down with a pocket full of poems that he had been writing, and he looked at us all and he said, "Don't just do something, stand there." But before we talk about what we're going to do, we're going to read some poems and reflect deeply on what's really happening in front of us.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, for folks that might not be familiar with the common prayer, you can there's a pocket version, and then there's a big daily version that we use. But you can also get it for free on a phone app for Android and for iOS, thanks to Jonathan and our friends that made that happen this year. We got it all updated, and I'm not a great singer, and some of us don't have anyone to sing with us right now. And so you can listen to the songs, and it's actually Root the House down there with Jonathan that sings the songs. So you can listen to that and sing along and know that we're praying with people all over the world. And I think that's one of the refreshing things about liturgy and resources like common prayers. Even though we might be, individuals, we're not alone as we're praying it, with others. And the other thing I wanted to mention. Oh yeah.
What is the name of the app? We'll post this too, but what is the name?
Common Prayer.
Common Prayer.
Yeah.
All right.
Published Excellent. In the Android and the iPhone stores by School for Conversion. So that's probably the easier way to find it. There's lots of
School for Conversion. Okay. And again, we'll post it when we post the webinar.
Some of that people can find at commonprayer.net too.
Okay.
So yeah. The other thing that we'll be doing, I think there's some really creative stuff on the services that I've seen, like Zoom choirs that are singing together. We're able to access incredible preaching now from people that you might not always go to. Like, I don't get to worship with Otis Moss in Chicago as much as I'd like, but I can hear him now, on Sundays. You can listen, maybe especially for some of us outside of some of the Black church traditions and other contexts, we could join a worship service that's maybe a new experience for us. And I'd really think this is a great opportunity to do that, to listen to some people that we might not be worshiping with when we're not in a pandemic. And the other thing that we're going to be doing, Jonathan's helping with this too, is we're starting a thing called midweek mobilizing on Wednesday evenings at 7 o'clock. That'll be live, kind of like this, at Red Letter Christians. And what we're going to be doing is, in addition to the prayer, we're talking about how can we support and work for justice in this pandemic. So one of the first people that we'll have will be Dr. Michelle Reyes and Kathy King, who are going to talk about the rise in anti-Asian racism that's happening related to this. And then we'll have Alexia Salvatierre that's going to talk about what this is, how it's affecting folks that are in detention, especially as we think of children that are separated from their parents and families that are separated, and very vulnerable to the disease and haven't done anything criminal. They're trying to pursue citizenship, things like that. So we want to, there's a proposal that folks that might be reunited with their families during the pandemic and out of the detention centers to find alternatives to that. So we'll be every week spotlighting a different, someone kind of on the front lines of justice work and Jesus work in the middle of the pandemic. And Jonathan will be on one of those too. So.
That's great. I can see that we're out of time, but I can see that a lot of the questions that have been submitted are wanting to know where to access some of the things that we've talked about. So we'll make sure that when we post this webcast, we'll do it on a page where we can just keep adding links of things we've talked about. I know Justine was saying that the Ken Burns Easter sermon is on YouTube. We'll make sure we post to that so people can watch that if they like. But all these different initiatives and ways people might be able to engage, we'll make sure we share. But I know some of you have meetings you've got to get to. Is there I know they close Renovaré board meetings with, is there the burden, does anyone have the burden of an unspoken word? So let me ask you, I'm sure there's about 10 million unspoken words here, but do any of you have a burden of an unspoken word, something that would be important to share before we wrap up here?
Well, there's a lot of pain, and in the midst of pain, I think it's easy to feel overwhelmed. It's easy to feel to turn in on ourselves. It can even be possible in the midst of pain, to look out if you're not feeling it yourself and feel guilty, that it's happening to somebody else, it's not happening to me. But I think in the midst of pain, I've learned that it's important to celebrate the gifts that we do have, and those are the things that sustain us through hard times. So I'm grateful for these friends. I'm grateful for the spiritual resources that Renovaré is committed to sharing and keeping alive in our tradition, and grateful for this time together. So let's keep practicing gratitude.
I'm thinking of John Paul II, to the sweet soul that asked about fear. I'm thinking of John Paul II. Be not afraid. Be not afraid. This has caught us off guard. It didn't catch God off guard. God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit haven't changed one whit. Be not afraid.
So good. Chris, would you just pray over us before we sign off?
Sure. How about a prayer of blessing? So I can't see you all, but this is for you. This is for you. May God's blessing rest upon you. You are loved. May God's blessing rest upon you. Lean into me. Lean into me. I will bless you. I will keep you. I will watch over you. Nothing can separate you from my love for you are my precious image bearers. May the blessing of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit rest upon you now and forevermore. Amen.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to everyone listening in. You asked such great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but hopefully this is just the beginning of a conversation with each other, with the Lord. And yeah, thank you. It's been good.
Thank y'all. Let's do it again sometime. We're grateful for Renovaré. Thanks for all y'all are doing. Bless you.
Love you.
Thank you.
Love you too.
Bye-bye.